Curioso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 239, A Viking Name for Copperopolis. As we did in the previous episode, we're going to talk about another major town in the south of Wales. Now, I don't know if we'll continue to do a series on each town or region through the next few months, but I've been thinking that this might be a good way to introduce at least some of the major places, kind of, or in some cases reintroduce them, because obviously some of these locations are places we've covered in the past, but some of them we haven't really delved into, just simply because for a lot of history their significance is a lot smaller. But as time goes on, especially around the changes that we're seeing with the industrialization, with coal especially, and the movement of coal in and out of Wales, we're seeing these towns suddenly become cities. We see villages becoming towns. And all of this starts to change the dynamic in Wales dramatically. And we're going to spend some time talking about the cultural changes that we'll see, including in the arrival of new leisure activities and new methods and new ideas about how we do things like purchasing and all of that kind of idea, but also about sports and how that affects society and what that means for Wales in general. And hopefully we'll have some guests in to help us some of that. But going forward, that's kind of where we're headed for the next foreseeable future as we continue to work our way through the Victorian period of Wales. So let's start off. The town in question that we're going to talk about today, now a city, of course, is Swansea. Swansea, of course, for many years has been the direct rival of Cardiff, and certainly in this period becomes such. And at one time was the more likely and more reasonable idea for a capital city before Cardiff, certainly in this period, just simply because up until now, it has been a growing port, a growing city in general, and had grown not as dramatically as Cardiff had, because it didn't have this sort of from tiny to towering in such a short period of time, which I think is the biggest reasoning. Now, as far as we know, Swansea's origins stretch back over 1,000 years. The name Swansea likely, though we don't know for sure, derives from the Norse Swansea, which I probably said wrong, but there we go, meaning Sven's Island, a nod to the town's Viking past. Of course, like a lot of Welsh areas that were on the borderlands between the water and the land, they did become targets of various peoples, from the Romans to the Irish to the Norse to the English eventually. And all of these areas become settled in some way or other. And in this case, that's where we believe Swansea originated. By the 12th century, it had become a Norman stronghold. Again, yet another invasion, with construction of the Swansea Castle beginning around 1106 under the lordship of Henry de Beaumont, someone who's very significant in early history of Swansea. De Beaumont was the first Earl of Warwick, who was granted the lordship of Gower, including Swansea, obviously. He played a key role in establishing Norman control over South Wales and laid the groundwork for the construction of the Swansea Castle, as mentioned previously, which, of course, as all of these Norman castles become, it's a symbol of power, it's a symbol of domination in the landscape, and set up in a place which is very obvious and very ominous, you might say. Today, if you go to Swansea, that castle is almost non-existent. It is very little left of it by comparison to, say, Cardiff, but you can see some of the remains. Throughout the medieval period, Swansea remains a relatively small market and port town. It was granted a borough charter in 1158. Of course, at this point, it's already completely in the English subset. It is long since been controlled by the Normans, and it becomes very much an English community, at least in that regard. Despite periodic Welsh uprisings, the English internal conflicts, Swansea held steadily in both population and in importance to the area. And if it wasn't necessarily something which, you know, we don't get into a lot of discussions about Swansea during the medieval period. Let's just put it that way. There is, in the early medieval period, especially during the reign of the Welsh princes, there's a lot of discussions about the area, but not necessarily of the community itself. And that's something to keep in mind. Now, as we move beyond the initial founding of the town and the creation of the castle, we run into another person of influence called Isabel de Clare, the daughter of Richard de Clare, who was known as Strongbow. Though she's more widely associated with Ireland through her marriage to William Marshal, she brings Gower into that relationship. And of course, Marshal is a massively important Norman lord at the time. He influences both Welsh and English politics and has massive influence with the government. And so he is a towering figure in early medieval Welsh history. And Isabel was, of course, a landholder in her own right and had considerable influence over the administration of her own estates, which, of course, included Swansea. Now, as we go forward, we go a little less on the lords and a little more on the town itself. In the 16th and 17th century, Swansea's coastal location and natural harbors positioned it for growth. Obviously, its access to the Bristol Channel and by extension the Irish Sea and eventually into the Atlantic meant that it was mildly protected, but it was also a port where, especially in the medieval period, that invasions happened nearby quite frequently. We saw this with both the French invasions with Owen Glyndwr and with even going back to the English Civil War. There will be more of this kind of thing going on. So it's an important enough place that it's drawing attention and it's seen as a place that could hold ships and they would be protected. So, of course, now as we go into the 17th century, as we get less into the warfare externally and get more into the developments of Britain as a whole, then we have Swansea developing into a much stabler location and one where shipbuilding and port structures are developed and it becomes a very safe place for people to park their ship. And of course, at the same time, with it becomes the industrial side of it. And it developed a reputation for coal, of course, as you would imagine, lime exports. And in the late 17th century, small scale copper works began, which will be incredibly influential to Swansea going forward from this point. In this period, of course, Swansea grew rapidly. It was still only about a population of 1,000 by the mid-16th century, but it doubled in size by the mid-17th century, so about 100 years later. The port of Swansea grew busier and busier as coal mining in South Wales boomed, obviously in the 19th century, and increasingly amounts of coal were exported from Swansea. And this goes back to our conversation about Cardiff and a comparison between it and Swansea. Swansea had a built-in structure. They had to build it from scratch in Cardiff. So having the advantage of the valleys just north or east, I guess kind of northwest of it, made it so that things would flow easier into Cardiff. But it wasn't like that was the only mine or the only industry in the area. And Swansea still became important in this period, especially in the 17th and 18th centuries. Iron was being exported from Swansea as part of this. And of course, as that happens, as you get the minerals moving, you also start to get textiles moving, as of course, wool weaving industries were very large at this time. They were slowly becoming industrialized themselves, and Swansea became a key port for that. This by the 16th century, so about 100 years earlier, Swansea had 3 fairs rather than just 2 of the norm in the Middle Ages. And by 1655, Cromwell said Swansea was an ancient port town and populace situated on the coast towards France. Not quite sure how that worked. Convenient for shipping and resisting foreign invasions, going back to our discussion earlier. Swansea Castle had been damaged by Owain Glyndŵr in the 1400s, and it was finally demolished by the parliamentarians in 1647 to prevent it from being used by the royalists, thus the reason why there's so little left of it now. By 1682, a grammar school, however, was founded in Swansea, and by 1750, Swansea probably had a population of about 3,000. So about every 100 years, it's growing by about 1,000 people, which in that period is probably pretty quick. If you remember in our discussions about education in the past, we've talked a little bit about how Swansea became important for education in Wales in driving both the nonconformists and the Anglicans into the area, competing with each other and driving a lot of the general increase and desire in education. And I think that's a real important structural part of Swansea's growth. Not only was there an industry and was there shipping, there was also education, which was developing along with it, which again points to why Swansea would be looked at as an obvious capital. You know, it's got a good port, it's got good industry, it's got a growing population, and it also has this driving education. And the other thing it adds, in the 1771, it gains its first bank, and by 1785, its first theater, all considered to be important to the development of a town into eventually a city. The growth of maritime trade also brought a shift in population and infrastructure. Swansea's ports handled goods ranging from wool to wine, but the real transformation came, of course, with the Industrial Revolution, and specifically in the 1800s, the rise of copper. This is where everything starts to heat up, quite literally. The 19th century marked a profound turning point. Swansea became known as the world's Copperopolis due to its dominance in copper smelting. Why Swansea, you might ask? Well, there's several factors to that. One, the prime proximity to high quality coal, obviously coming out of the valleys, access to an obvious port for importing the ore itself from Chile and Cuba, and a skilled and effective workforce in developing this metal into something useful. By 1823, Swansea smelted over 70% of the world's copper. The lower Swansea Valley was transformed into a dense corridor for smelting works, smokestacks, canals, and tramways. It was a Victorian, a dream to a lot of Victorian industrialists, kind of a nightmare in our own perception of how it would look with all the coal smoke and the constant industrial waste and development and all of that stuff. You have to remember that the way people looked at things then is very different than now. And one of the things is that industry was looked as progress, not with a environmental eye. And so that kind of thing would lead people to assuming that Swansea was the place to be, which I think is an interesting side effect to that. Major industrialists like Vivian and Sons, someone we'll mention a little bit more on, Williams, Foster's and Co., led the charge, amassing both wealth and influence in the area. Specifically, John Henry Vivian was born in 1785. Vivian was a prominent industrialist and politician who helped transform Swansea into a global center for copper smelting. His influence wasn't just economic, however. He also served as a member of parliament and was a driving force behind improving local infrastructure and education. This industrial explosion brought a massive population boom. So we've been mentioning that things have been growing by about 1,000 people every 100 years. While in 50 years, it's gone from being 3,000 to doubling in size to 6,000 in 1801. Swansea's population rose to over 26,000 in 50 years in 1851. And this all came from the urban development, but also created challenges, some of which we've mentioned, such as pollution, but also overcrowding and disease, something that's very common in early Victorian industrial areas, as there's no real understanding of the damage that's being done. So there's a lot of work that ends up happening after the fact to try and fix some of these things. But keep in mind, this is a massive development of people. Like this place went from just being a small little side town to being a massive town in short order in a way that wouldn't really be seen until the modern era, where populations can move en masse quite quickly into some places. You just didn't have that happening normally, and especially in Wales. This did not really start until this point. And this goes back to what we've been discussing, which is that even though there's an exodus of people out of Wales at this time, loads of people are moving in the next 100 years, basically, to various places. There is also a mass of people moving in because the economy is so important, especially in South Wales, that the jobs are there. And as you know, if there's jobs, people are moving to take the jobs. People are being enticed to take the jobs. And so it becomes important for people to be there and to, they would look at it as helping their families, because moving to a place where you get paid better, there might be better conditions, better education. By perspective to being a rural person working on a farm, living hand to mouth, having drought ruin your income and all sorts of things, just having so much more influence over the situation. And of course, the industrialization of farms is only just beginning. It's nowhere near what it'll be eventually, but at this point, it's just beginning. So you have very much a different kind of world when you go to the urban environments. And I think that has a massive change in how the urban areas of Wales suddenly become much more populous very quickly. Industrialization, of course, has tons to do with that. So as the Swansea's urban landscape changes, there are new housing that needs built, although often they're very small, cramped, they're poorly built, which is a big problem, something you see quite often in boom areas where you have rapid growth happening. And so people have to meet that growth. And so sometimes corners are cut, things are done just to smack stuff up quickly, make as much money off it as you can. Obviously, that's a side effect to it. But it's important to remember that these things aren't just happening in a vacuum. There's a reason why they're doing it. It's not just to make money. It's also the fact that there is a demand, which also creates that desire to make more. Infrastructure such as the Swansea Canal was built in 1794, then followed up later with the Swansea and Mumbles Railway, which opened for passengers in 1807 and was the first passenger railway in the world, which I think is an amazing achievement, supported by, of course, both industry and mobility of the population that we mentioned earlier. Swansea also grew culturally. In 1835, it becomes a municipal borough, gaining more formal political structure. Education expands in this situation with the founding of schools, public buildings like the Guildhall, and eventually the Royal Institution of South Wales, founded in 1835, which would promote science and learning. Massively important to note that education was becoming a big key to a lot of this. And I think something that gets a bit forgotten as we look back is how influential teaching people basics of math, science, literacy that we just take for granted these days or expect as a right, as you often hear, wasn't a right in those days, and it was just starting to become such. And what it does is it changes the philosophy of a lot of people, because suddenly people see this as the right of culture. If you're going to be a culturally important place, education has to be there. Suddenly, and excuse the phrasing, but the peasants needed to know how to read, whereas before they didn't, and it didn't matter because they weren't important enough. Well, now all of a sudden, in a society that's growing exponentially and in industry that's growing exponentially, being able to read the manual is suddenly important. Being able to understand what you're being tasked to do is important, and it all becomes too big to just be done by the local journeyman and his apprentice. It has to be done by thousands or hundreds of people, and it has to be repetitive and it has to be taught easily. And so education starts to become more important for that. The idea that people become more upwardly mobile comes out of this sudden idea that economically you can get ahead, which, I mean, the argument is that this may have existed prior to this, but the real understanding and the real acceptance from all sectors of society only starts at this point, and it starts to influence other, especially English-speaking countries. I mean, the American dream is a great picture of that concept. The idea that you might start out small and yet grow to great heights, become this wealthy person or popular person or politically important person, all while having nothing that links you to that before then, is something new, really, because before that, a lot of it was about who you were, who you were born to. And now all of a sudden we're starting to see this change. Of course, there were middle classes before this. Of course, there were industrial classes before this. There were people who were important that had nothing, that had come from nothing into something, but that doesn't mean it was normal. And this is starting to change, and it's influencing Europe in a way that I don't think even they understood. And it was definitely influencing the colonies, because all the colonies have this dynamic happening there as well. And so all of this is sort of happening at once. Well, in Wales, of course, it's happening on a massive scale very quickly due to the way this is all working. And I think that's something to keep in mind as we go forward, that you will see this cultural change happening. Due to this advancement, it gave people such as Lewis Weston Dilwyn, a botanist and porcelain manufacturer, the opportunity to develop his science skills. And as the owner of Cambrian pottery, he played a pivotal role in Swansea's artistic and scientific development during the early 1800s. Dilwyn's botanical work was internationally recognized, and he helped cultivate a spirit of learning and culture in the community. It also encouraged his children to continue to promote these cultural expansions, to promote education in the area. The one person who comes to mind is Louisa Dilwyn. She, like the rest of her relatives, took a strong interest in science and social reform, something which is becoming incredibly important in Wales at this time. The Dilwyns, especially Louisa and her later niece, Amy Dilwyn, were well known for their intellectual curiosity, progressive values, and early feminist thinking. Also worth mentioning is Mary Dilwyn, a pioneering figure in photography, and other members of the Dilwyn family who had an effect on society throughout Wales. Mary took some of the earliest known candid photographs in Wales, and in the 1840s and 50s, her work offered a rare and intimate glimpse into the Victorian domestic life, and she is now recognized as one of the first female photographers in Britain. Like other industrial owners' wives that we've mentioned in previous episodes, Sarah Scale, who is the wife of John Henry Vivian, who we mentioned earlier, played a strong behind-the-scenes role in local charity efforts supporting education, healthcare, and the relief of the poor, particularly in the rapidly growing and often difficult to manage industrial town. As you can imagine, we again mentioned this a few times, a lot of the wives of the industrial owners would at times get involved with trying to make things better for their community. In some respects, some argue with the guise of trying to protect themselves from problems with the workforce, having strikes and union developments and all of those kind of things. And so one way to do that is to use, especially in the Victorian period, it was seen as if the women were involved, it was much harder to kind of rise up against them and go against them in a way that you would say that the male person in charge. And there may be some truth to that. I would also counter that by saying a lot of these people weren't just doing it because of that. I think there was in the back of their minds a desire to see the local population become better and have a better life. I don't think it's just about doing things for, dollar remunerations. I think it was also done because there was a sense of charitable giving that was developing in this period. Like, keep in mind, prior to this, you have a big shift in who controls and who should be the social benefactors of society. In the Middle Ages, it was the Catholic Church. Well, that didn't really migrate effectively to the Anglican Church because you have a breakup of the churches in England over time. And so there isn't the monasteries or the hospitals of those periods, which worked and acted as a way to protect society's poor. Now you have No one really doing that. And we're seeing the worst of it in society because so much is happening so quickly with the rise in population and the increasing living spaces being so compressed. It is creating health problems. So you can understand why some people would look at it and go, well, this is hurting my bottom line. I better do something about it. But there are also people who are like, I don't really want to walk around my city and see a bunch of people suffering. That's not what I want to see. I want my, workers to be happy so that they come in and they work hard and they are productive. Something that's talked a lot about these days about productivity. Well, your productivity is not great if you're starving. Your productivity is not great if you don't understand what it is you're trying to do. And mistakes can be made quite easily in those situations. And I think that's where we start to see this shift in the upper classes specifically to try and meet some of this. It isn't everybody. Don't get me wrong. There are still the Scrooges, if you want to use that example, who are out there just to earn a buck or a pound or a quid, I guess, if we want to be more correct. That, however, is starting to not be everybody. And there is this growing movement, especially in South Wales, amongst various people to try and mitigate some of the worst of this. And I think we're seeing that. So that's something that I think we need to give them a slight benefit of the doubt. I'm not saying everything's, like I said, it's not all generosity, but I think we need to give some semblance of to people who are possibly doing it out of the goodness of their hearts, out of a desire to improve the lifestyles of others. And people like Vivian who are involved in politics, again, it might be a completely selfish reasoning, but sometimes selfish reasonings achieve good aims. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with that if it does, even if it's not from the bottom of their heart and it's more from the bottom of their purse. So I think that's something we need to keep in mind. And it's always hard to know motives unless you're reading their diaries or whatever. You can't always tell why people are doing what they're doing. And sometimes they're doing it for the right reason and sometimes they're not. And sometimes it's just okay. Even if they're doing it for the wrong reason, if it's still achieving basically a good thing without damaging other people along the way, I think that's important. And I think it needs to be recognized as such. So to go back to our story of Swansea as a whole, while its fame is largely built on copper, as we've mentioned, its docks also echoed with the sounds of saws, hammers, and the ring of shipwrights at work. Shipbuilding, often overshadowed by the smelting industry, still played a vital role in Swansea's rise as a global port city, something that would draw people in even from other parts of Wales and England and other places in general. But that's how important it was. It was drawing people in from other places who had the skills or wanted to develop the skills. Shipbuilding is important, and in this era, especially as we're moving from wooden ships into iron ships, it becomes very important. In the early 1800s, demands for ships were enormous. Copper was needed to be imported from the mines across the world, such as Chile, Cuba, Australia, and even Cornwall, and the final product was then exported from the places that it was then used to develop into the end tools or end equipment or end decoration, depending on what it is. The shipping boom from this sparked the growth of local shipyards across the mouth of the River Towy and within Swansea's rapidly expanding South Dock system, first opened in 1852. And you can see that this is open roughly around the same time that Cardiff is starting to do similar. Early on, many of the vessels that visited Swansea, of course, as I mentioned, were built of oak and other timbers, and usually came from North America and from the Baltic. In fact, there was quite the cottage system in northeastern parts and the Maritimes of Canada where all of these trees were being cut down. And because they were old growth and very tall, so they could be used for masts and things quite easily. So it was important to have that. In places like Wales and England at the time, you just didn't have the same level of access to timber. So it was incredibly important and very profitable for those areas at the time. But as time goes on, this starts to change, of course. As these wooden ships carried coal, copper, ore, and later industrial goods, they would, of course, be important to the industry, but they could only take so much. You could only build a wooden ship so big. And by the 1830s, Swansea had a small but significant shipbuilding industry that produced sloops, brigs, schooners, and later barks, a workhorse of the 19th century trade. One notable yard was the Vivian shipyard. Surprise, surprise, Vivian's involved, a part of the larger Vivian industrial empire. Another key player was the company known as Richardson, Duck and Co., which also operated in Swansea before focusing elsewhere in the northeast of Wales. Though Swansea never rivaled the massive shipbuilding centres of Clyde or the Teesside, it carved a niche for smaller purpose-built coastal and cargo vessels. As the century progressed, iron-hulled ships obviously became to replace the wooden ones, and while Swansea shipyards were slow to fully embrace iron construction compared to other parts of Britain, local foundries and engineering firms began to produce parts for the steamships. The port itself was a magnet for steamers, especially after the construction of the Prince of Wales dock in 1881, just after the cutoff of this particular episode, which we're kind of looking at Swansea into the 1870s. But the seeds of it were planted well before. By the 1860s, Swansea's docks were bustling not only with global trade, but with construction, fitting out, repair of various vessels that powered its economy. Local craftsmanship in rigging, carpentry, sail making, and rope making supported the industry as a whole, with thousands employed directly or in some cases indirectly. Shipbuilding also reinforced Swansea's cosmopolitan character. Obviously, if you have ships coming in there from across the world, you have sailors coming in there from across the world. So people from Europe, Africa, and the Americas, as well as Asia, pass through these ports, many staying and in some cases to work or to settle. These international ties added to the cultural complexity that was quickly becoming one of Wales' most outwardly looking towns. And we'll start to see, especially in the latter half of the 1800s and into the 1900s, the entire makeup of Wales start to become much more multicultural because of the colonial connections that were being built up by the British, but also because people were coming back into Wales for various reasons. And we'll see a change in how that made Wales view itself differently. And of course, as we've talked about, the riches of copper did not benefit all equally. Working conditions in smelting works were hazardous. Workers inhaled toxic fumes, handled dangerous materials, endured long hours. And industrial Swansea was a city of sharp contrasts. There was a wealth of the few and hardship for many. And of course, we always mention that. So you always have to go back to that. You always have to understand that it's not just all, the same for everyone. The 1830s and 1840s saw waves of cholera epidemics, and the valleys echoed with protests over the Chartist movement and demanding voter rights and better conditions. And they found support in Swansea for obvious reasons. In 1842, striking workers in Swansea marched in solidarity with the national movement, though unrest was largely suppressed. Women and children also worked in the copper industry, often, of course, in brutal conditions. Reformers began to call attention to these injustices and laying early groundwork for labor reforms in the latter half of the century. And we're starting to see this. We've started to talk about it. We're going to talk about it in way more in depth. There is a change coming to how specifically children are viewed in the workplace, and how there is this idea that maybe there needs to be a cutoff that's much higher than what used to be. Instead of being, 6, 7, 8, or 9, maybe we start cutting off around 15, 16, maybe 17, 18. And those things start to become important. And the idea that maybe children should be educated and not working in the workforce does start to grow in demand in this period. As copper works reshaped the skyline and the shipyards lined the docks, Swansea's social fabric also was undergoing profound changes. The influx of workers, merchants, engineers, and seafarers in the 19th century gave rise to not just booming populations, but new forms of community life, civic pride, and cultural tension. By the mid-century, the divide between the wealthy industrial elite and the working class was stark. Industrialists like Vivian, Dilwyn, and the Grenfield families, who we haven't mentioned, began to build massive villas with leafy western suburbs such as Sketty and the uplands, while laborers crammed into hastily built terraces in the lower Swansea Valley. These geographic divisions etched class boundaries directly onto the city's layout. Obviously, something you'll see in across many cities. This is not specific to Swansea. There are loads of neighborhoods, even where I live, where you know where the rich people are versus those people who are not so wealthy. Yet, alongside these divides, Swansea also developed a robust civic spirit. As early as the 1830s, philanthropic initiatives, often led by nonconformist religious leaders and liberal minded industrialists, helped to establish public libraries, mechanic institutes, and reading rooms. Libraries are more or less an invention of the Victorian period, and it's something that we're going to talk much more in depth because it does become incredibly important to the developing of the cultural understanding of society. And I think in some ways it's important to understand this because I think it creates way more understanding that people in this period aren't uneducated, aren't as lacking in education or in reading specifically, that they did read more about the world. Now, of course, they read a lot of popular stuff, a lot of fictional type things that weren't necessarily accurate, but being described as such. There's a lot of that going around even at this point. But I think we sometimes forget just how literate society was by this time and how that influenced a lot of things that were going on. And education was championed not just as a path to self-improvement, of course, but as a way of creating more disciplined and a moral workforce. If you could read the Bible, mentioned this lots of times before, you would understand the gist of how to be a great Anglo-Saxon Protestant, to use the phrasing, who had the moral fiber to understand what a good Christian does and how they work. And the old work ethic argument starts to come up at this time, and this concept that somehow the Germanic people were somehow better and harder, and fill in the blank, all these things, the excuses that people come up with to be racist start to grow in this period, and we're definitely going to get into more of this later, don't worry. The towns also became a hotbed of religious diversity. While the Anglican Church remained prominent, nonconformist chapels flourished, particularly amongst the Welsh-speaking working classes. Baptists, Methodists, and Congregationalists all built impressive places of worship throughout the town. These chapels were not just spiritual centers, they were also sites of the Welsh language, and it helped in its preservation in South Wales. And also, they were sites of political debate and community activism. Of course, we've talked a little bit about some of that in the past, specifically around some of the nonconformist politicians who led the way in a lot of reform movements that were happening in Wales at the time. Of course, it's impossible to talk about pre-20th century Swansea without mentioning George Grant Francis, the 19th century antiquarian and local historian who was born in 1814. Francis was instrumental in preserving Swansea's historical record and monuments. His efforts helped to ensure that the story of Swansea's past, its people, its buildings, its battles, were not lost to time. Something that was, again, and I've mentioned this over and over, so I hate the fact that I keep repeating it, the importance in what the Victorians were doing as they started to understand about scientific archaeology in preserving what had been, sometimes to its detriment, sometimes to the positive. Culturally, Swansea nurtured both English and Welsh traditions. It hosted Eisteddfods and Welsh language cultural festivals that blended music, poetry, and patriotism, while also supporting more Anglicanized institutions such as the Royal Institute of South Wales, which opened a museum and lecture series in the 1840s. These dual identities of Welsh and being British, industrial and cultural, coexisted in a city trying to define itself. And it's important to remember that when we talk about Wales in this time period, most of the population still speaks Welsh, still understands Welsh, but there is a slow migration of English speakers that are coming in, and they're starting to influence the way, especially in South Wales, things developed. If you want to know why especially south and the southeast part of Wales is probably the most English speaking and the least likely to speak Welsh. That's part of the reason. Women also carved out significant roles in the social life in Swansea. While many worked in domestic service or light industry, others were active in church life, charitable work, and early educational reforms. Sunday schools and temperance movements often relied on female leadership. Often women's positions were limited, but they were important, and they did have some public influence. As Swansea expanded, so too did its appetite for modern amenities such as gas lighting, and not in the modern sense, but actually gas lighting the streets, piped water, which was slowly introduced after decades of campaigning for it, improved roads reflecting growing middle-class pressure for urban improvements. Debates over public health, housing, and sanitation led to the formation of local boards and improvement commissions, as well as the precursor to more comprehensive municipal governments that would, of course, be established late in the century. In essence, between 1800 and 1870, Swansea was not only building ships smelting copper, it was inventing itself as a modern civic-minded town. It was a place where labor met learning, where chapel hymns echoed beside factory whistles, where a new and complex urban identity was being forged day by day. And of course, by 1870, Swansea stood on both a triumph of industrial progress and a cautionary tale of the costs of that same rising industry. While copper smelting began to decline in the latter half of the century, in part due to changes in technology and ore sources, the town remained an important industrial and commercial hub as its port continued to grow and new industries like tin plate and zinc began to take hold. Culturally, Swansea had matured. Institutions like the Glen Vivian Arts Gallery had expanded the Royal Institution of South Wales, which signaled a growing middle-class interest in the arts and sciences. But for many working families, life would, as you can imagine, remain a struggle and a trial. The landscape itself changed. The once green valley was now coated in smoke and slag, the unfortunate side effect of all this industry. Early environmental degradation would take over a century to address, and something that would result in many years of industrialization in south and eastern Wales, choking clouds of coal smoke, which would live like a stain across the Victorian landscape. Again, something we mentioned with Cardiff, the remnants of which you can still see today on the buildings. There are literally layers of what is obviously coal smoke on them that you can see, especially in the Victorian chapels. All of that kept in mind, however, the growth of Swansea as a major center in the history of especially modern Wales is driven in this period. And I think it's important to understand just how much these cities that we think of in their current standpoint grew very quickly in less than 100 years from being a little backwater village or tiny town into something much more influential and much more important on the landscape of the society of Wales and would influence it for years to come. And with all of that, I'd like to thank you all for watching or listening today. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com, or you can reach out to me on various social media at Welsh History Pod. But on Facebook, we're at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. And hey, if you'd like to help the podcast out, you can always do so through a donation on patreon.com/Welsh History. Thank you all for listening once again. Have yourselves a wonderful rest of your day. Take care. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.